Thank you all, and thanks for being here. We're going to give you a brief overview of a research project that Alex and I are carrying out right now into radical social movements in Halifax, Nova Scotia. And I'm going to give you a sense of what motivated the project and some of the concerns that we're looking at, and then Alex is going to tell you a little bit about how it's going and how we planned it out and how it's proceeding. The project seeks to take up the question of what the radical imagination is. If you're interested in that topic, we just released a journal issue of Affinities online at affinitiesjournal.org, which answers the question conclusively and for all time. So I encourage you to go there and have all your questions answered. Good night. No. It tends to be the case that in social movements and radical social movements, we feel the absence of radical imagination acutely, especially within the North American society in which we operate and organize. We take up the imagination as that sort of critical capacity we have to put the world together in our mind, and the sense that the social world we live in is made up of social structures and structures of power, but those structures are actualized through people's actions and interactions. And imagination is a key part of the way that people internalize the world that they experience and then act in that world. And when we talk about the radical imagination, what I think we're looking for is the sense that people have, or hopefully glean, that they can change the world that they're a part of. And that they can change it for the better. Things don't need to remain the way they are. The problem is that the way that we tend to conceive of and talk about the radical imagination, we tend to talk about it in a very static, almost commodified way. That it's this thing frozen in time, and that that we either have it or we don't. We're working with people trying to radicalize people in our teaching, in our organizing, and either people have the radical imagination or they don't. We want to move towards understanding the imagination as a collective process rather than an individualized thing that can be had. And in that, trying to rethink of imagination that way, we're inspired in part by a sort of legacy within Western theoretical traditions, but also by histories of struggle. And specifically struggles against oppression, power, authority, and racism, patriarchy, and all the other things that require an imagination of what the world could be like in the absence of those forces. Oh, okay. The second thing we wanted to look at when we started thinking about this project we wanted to do on social movements is try and chart a course, a path between a few tendencies of social movement research. Some of the problems and possibilities of which were addressed yesterday in Chris and others' session about radical research. And we identified two sort of broad strategic approaches we wanted to find a way out of. One of them is the approach where, as social movement researchers and researchers of radicalism, we go out and we sort of do reporting on radical movements. And there's a number of very good reasons for doing that sort of research, and we don't want to denigrate that sort of research at all. It offers those sorts of movements a narrative. It puts them within a historical context. It puts them in historical record. It can allow movements to communicate across geographic and temporal distances. And it legitimates those movements often with the sort of academic capital that we bring to bear when we do this sort of research, if we're doing it within the academy. So that's one strategy that we wanted to see if we could do something else, because as was pointed out in the session yesterday, there's questions about accountability with that. To whom are we accountable? Are we only accountable to ourselves? Are we accountable to the academic system that either employs us or underemploys us? Who exactly are we accountable to when we do that sort of reportage sort of research? The other tendency we wanted to see if we could think outside of is the probably actually, from my perspective, a better tendency, which is to somewhat see ourselves as researchers disappear into the social movements we're researching and put our research services at the disposal of those movements themselves and take direction. And again, like the first option, I don't want to denigrate that. Fantastic work has been done, and that work really, I mean, that is probably the work we should all be doing. Where we eschew the privilege that we've been given as researchers, whether we're academics or not, or put that privilege at the disposal of the movements we're working with. What we wanted to do is something slightly different. We wanted... Is this you? That's you.
This is still you.
This is still me.
Yep.
Okay. Yes, very quickly. we wanted to ask ourselves, how can we investigate and interrogate our subject positions as researchers to do something different that hasn't been done with social movements, and something social movements aren't doing themselves. And in Halifax in particular, we were interested because it's a place where social movements really haven't cohered into durable forms. It's a lot of different groups and tendencies and formations working together on different sorts of projects. So how can we intervene as researchers in that space in ways that don't just see us making our services available and don't just see us reporting, but doing something different? And we came up with the idea of convoking the radical imagination.
Exactly. So Halifax, as Max was just saying, is interesting for a couple of different reasons. And one of the reasons is, well, we're located there, right? So we wanted, rather than going away, rather than seeking out movements that are glamorous or well reported on or, radicalizing in terms of our imaginations, we wanted to see how we could put this research project in the service of a rather fragmented but dedicated activist community in a smaller urban space in a relatively marginal region in the Canadian state, and so our project really emerged in the aftermath of something that happened in 2006 in Halifax. Which probably didn't receive a lot of coverage here, but there was a major protest event against what's known as the Northeastern Atlantic Gateway, basically a quintessential neoliberal development project. The protest that emerged around it was, in some ways, and it's probably not a very kind way to put it, but an attempt to recreate some of the militancy and drama that happened in Seattle in 1999, for folks who couldn't have actually been there because they were too young to be there. And it went down in Halifax. It was an utter and total debacle for numerous reasons, and it blew up some very important alliances and very important groups that were doing great work on the ground. And it undermined a lot of that activity. So when Max and I came to this project, we did so in light of trying to figure out a way that this project could actually work to catalyze some of those groups again, to bring them back together and to get them into conversation, rather than, because we have our ideas about what our radical imaginations are and how the world ought to be changed, but it wasn't our position that we wanted to impose that on these groups. We wanted to offer it as a space for them to do that themselves, but also to provide ways to think past some of the existing barriers and some of the dramas that get repeated endlessly in the circles that we travel in. So what did we do? Well, we figured that qualitative research approach could actually provide the space in which to provide some of this convocation of the radical imagination, to really to allow people to conjure it into being. So the project began by actually holding a series of public outreach meetings where people who self-identified as radicals in the community came together and brainstormed what kind of research project they thought would be useful for their own struggles. We held a couple of different meetings. This would have been in the winter of the previous year, and out of that came a much more sort of coherent idea of what would be useful. And consistently, people wanted to have, rather than actually having a project that would map what's going on, they wanted to have spaces that they could make use of, where they could speak to each other in ways that weren't always friendly. Weren't always polite, but conversations that needed to be had. So our first phase, which began in September of this past year, began with in-depth, open-ended interviews that are just one-on-one between members of the research team and folks self-identifying as radicals in and around Halifax. And rather than the traditional method of doing interviews with activists, where you do the interview, you transcribe it, you pick it apart, you use bits of it that are useful to developing your own theory. This is a very familiar academic approach, where we validate our own intellectual theories around this sort of stuff by using people's words. We actually didn't want to do that at all. We wanted to provide a space where people could actually begin to think about their own radical imagination. So through a series of interviews, which we audio recorded very high quality so we can digitally rebroadcast them, we've interviewed approximately 30 activists. That stage is still ongoing.